Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Apotheosis on in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, Let Yourself Sleep. He was the only thing in Haven that I could understand. There was no understanding the chains around my wrists, or the angry interrogation. There was no understanding 1,000 charred bodies, or the sickly green glow that poured from the sky. There was no understanding the throbbing pain that split the palm of my hand, or the twisted magic that seemed to poison my mana. No understanding demonic ichor strewn across the snow, or a beardless dwarf laying gentle kisses on a blood-splattered crossbow. But an elven mage slinging a barrier of protection around me? An elder grabbing my hand to teach me new magic? A soft-spoken Haran, explaining my purpose in the chaos? That was a world that made sense, and everything I knew about being first. If such an elf would lend his magic to their cause, I could do no less. In those early days, solace was a lifeline. When the initial crisis had passed, I was given another thing beyond my understanding, a little house in Haven. I often awoke in a panic, the walls seeming to close in around me, blocking the comfort of the stars with something as mundane as a ceiling. I'd slip out the door, onto the roof, and over the walls of the settlement to stealth past the troops in their tents. I'd scramble across the frozen river and into the woods, to a place where I'd stowed blankets and a flask. That's all I needed. Just an hour under the stars, with a tree against my back, and enough pilfered brandy to burn away the ragged edges. And then one night he was there, barefoot like me in the snow, long fingers secured around an arrow. One slender ear quirked at my approach, and a tug at the corner of his mouth told me I was safe. He held himself motionless for a moment more, adjusted his aim, and let the arrow fly. I couldn't see his prey from where I stood, but I'd no doubt that he'd made a kill. If you can run headlong into the woods without startling a doe, it seems the Dalish may yet have some skill to pass on. I ducked my head into an approximation of a bow, Ma Serenis. Somewhere along the way, my people had wronged him. That an elf as soft-spoken and subtle as Solace made no effort to conceal his disdain spoke to the depth of the injustice. It was a shame as sure as the long walk, because we so desperately needed people like him if we were to ever reclaim what was lost. That was the night I showed him my little cache, and built a fire while he dressed the deer, as skillfully as any Dalish, not that I told him so. Huddled next to him by the fire, I could close my eyes and pretend that I was home. We shared the flask and he told a story of when the hero of Ferelden had traveled through these woods. She was an elf and a mage too, but circle-trained and thus strange to us both. Have you ever been with a human? He was thinking of her Alistair, I'd been sure. There seemed enough age between us that I felt no tension in the question, or judgment hanging on my answer. I'd heard it said that elven and human bodies made ill-fitting puzzle pieces, though some smirked their appreciation of the mismatch. I have not. My clan kept clear of cities, for the most part. We occasionally welcomed Shemlin into camp, particularly apostates, but none caught my eye. You. Once, he said, almost too casually. I do not recommend it. His candor surprised a laugh from me. It's the hair, all over their faces. I've no stomach for fur. I take it Bianca need not be jealous of your affection for Master Tathras. I laughed again, this time in earnest. He sports a marvelous carpet, but the Lady Crossbow has nothing to fear. He smiled to himself, took a nip from my flask. Despite myself, I'd noticed the smoothness of his scalp, like carved marble. And those ears. I capped the flask when he returned it to me. Clearly I'd had enough. I know it must not seem like it now, but you'll grow to appreciate those human beds de laine. Their fine linen and down, the herbs strewn in the bedding and the sandalwood posts. Give it time. Let yourself sleep there, however much you'd rather be under the stars. You'll find it easier to step into their world if you let yourself wake in theirs. The night air was so very still, and for the first time since the explosion it felt as if I weren't drowning in chaos. Chapter 2, Boots and Socks. Solace was right. Once I learned not to panic at the sense of sea foam rising up all around, I found a certain womb-like security in my fluffy human bed. I'd sleep steadier in the arms of an iron bark or in a ravel, but learning to live in a little house, to confine my fires to a hearth, to open and close a blighted door? It shed light on how it must feel to be human. They needed to be safe from prying eyes, needed to be safe from fearful skies. Then they'd compartmentalize every want so that the chantry stood here, the apothecary there, and the tavern down the way. For a clan, it all jumbled together, our worshipping and healing and drinking. Without doors or walls, privacy was just the notion of certain things of which we would not speak. However lonely my little house, it seemed lonelier still to imagine my safety depended on a bolted door rather than the watchful eyes of my lethalin. Some nights I'd sit in my little house, studying the walls until it felt like they were strong instead of confining, until the fire in the hearth seemed cradled rather than caged, until I forgot how many great oaks were felled in its making. Then I'd pull on a pair of boots and imagine myself a human girl, ears soft and round. Sometimes I'd walk to the tavern, pretend I were choosing a suitor from among the bearded men. But it was Varric who'd always pull me to his table, and with him I never needed to pretend. It was obvious, even if I hadn't read Tale of the Champion, that he knew a thing or two about shepherding lost Dalish mages. He'd tease me whenever I'd forget to wear socks under my boots, so many rules about feet, and explain the figures of speech that hindered me. He taught me how to play wicked grace, how to hold a knife more like cutlery than a weapon, and how to swear like a dwarf. Don't get me wrong, it's pure poetry, he said before hitching his voice to a falsetto, may the dread wolf take you. But humans don't know what you're talking about. Gotta find something with more oomph. Other times I'd shove the boots under my bed to seek out solace in the woods. He set aside his staff to hunt with a bow every night, taking small game for himself and bringing larger kills to Thrin. Solitude seemed precious to him, so however much I longed for the company of another elf, I forced myself not to intrude too often. In our travels, I discovered Solace to be an uncanny marksman. He was more fluent in Elven than myself, more familiar with Dalish lore, and more proficient in elemental magic. Despite the damning lack of Valislin, he was no city elf. His manner marked him as one of the people, however much he scorned them. The first time we argued over that point, I called him Haran in my apology. Without even a moment's hesitation, he called me Delenn in return, and so far as I was concerned things were settled between us. Where the humans buried me under titles without meaning, Knife-ear, Apostate, then Herald of Andrastel long before Inquisitor, I gave myself purpose as first to a surrogate keeper. These were titles that meant something. After a hunt one night, we sat facing each other across the fire, and he surprised me with a question. Why do you join me here? I knew enough of hunting to sense a trap. He expected me to fall back on something inherently elven, perhaps, but I'd no intention of giving him the satisfaction. Not that it was any stretch to think of another reason. You practice a magic unlike any other. Not when I hunt, he said to lay a second trap. Liar. I reached for him through the veil, playfully pushing a bit of mana from the mark on my hand to send traces of green light shimmering over his features. I've never seen a mage pull their aura as close as a second skin. Something in the way his brows knit together told me I'd done the wrong thing. Perhaps he'd thought I was scoffing at him, the way Vivian and Dorian so often did. It is unexpected of you to notice. He said nothing further on the subject, but I'd felt bad about it for days. Nothing seemed amiss on our travels, but after that he wore his aura as loose and swirling as any other mage. I wanted to shrug it off, but the change gnawed at me and I thought it better to give him his space. In the evenings, I began pestering Blackwell instead, who taught me as he'd taught the refugees I'd found him with when we first met. He showed me how to better guard my flank, how to stand my ground. He helped me choose the metals and leather to craft a blade for my staff, then showed me drills I could practice until I grew used to the added weight. Some weeks later he insisted on walking me home, then lingered on my doorstep long enough for me to realize that a human girl in her human boots might accept the thing that he wordlessly offered. So I didn't back away when he took a step closer, and I didn't pull my hand from his when he lifted it to his mouth. His lips were warm and full, and he placed a kiss on the top of my hand with a gentleness that surprised as much as the softness of his beard. He gave a shallow bow, asked for nothing more. My lady. And that was that. The next morning I woke to a Dalish longbow set beside me on the bed. However much Solace pretended that he wasn't defined by his elven features, and however much I pretended to be a human girl, it was only some shared shred of culture that made the gesture sweet. A human girl would not appreciate being watched, but my boots were shoved under the bed and my ears knife sharp. Chapter 3, Territorial. What's this about? I could have sworn you were a mage. Dorian was leaning against the doorframe of his little house, eyeing me as I came up the path. He was, quite simply, the most handsome Shemlin I'd ever seen. I loved everything about him, from his confidence and brash magic to the way he made even certain death sound like marvelous fun. I loved him for saving us, for being the only person who truly understood what was at stake, and for never, ever, bringing it up. He stroked his mustache a moment. Perhaps I was thinking of another elf. I do have trouble telling you all apart. Then how do you know that I am not a handsome man, come to seduce you? That is a good question, he said, appraising me from head to toe. You're so scrawny I think I might almost be able to pretend, so long as we left your pants on. Shame about your ears then, because I might have been willing to overlook that mustache. He splayed his fingers across his chest, curled his lip back in horror. Overlook my mustache? Ah, now I recognize you, you're that horrible herald of some such. At your service. Then tell me this, why do you and that ragged little hedge mage insist on plunging arrows into helpless woodland creatures when you could simply cast a spell to have them dead and roasted all at once? Because hunting let me feel as if I weren't so far from my clan, and every pull of a bowstring was a prayer to Andruil. Because there was tranquility out in the snow, unblemished by demons and shades. Because I'd concede to any task, however mundane, for the sake of his company. But those weren't answers I was willing to share, not even with Dorian. Nostalgia, I suppose. It feels good to draw on strength rather than mana, to remember what it was like before becoming a mage. He made a disgusted tchhh noise with his tongue. How dreadful. And here I was about to invite you to join us. By then he was retreating into his cottage, waving me off with one hand. No, no, run along. I have some potions to alphabetize. I crossed the snowy square to the hut Thrin had assigned to Salas, then paused with my hand on the latch. I'd been among the humans just long enough to second-guess my decision to push it open without knocking, but in a moment it was done. Salas was perched on the corner of his desk, at work on the foot wraps he always wore. There you are, he said without looking up from his task. When he'd tucked the loose end of the strap into place, he stood and strode out the door with his bow, and I'd barely had time to step out of his way. He said nothing of the night before. As we set out for the logging stand, a question burned in my mind. The night at Redcliffe Castle had been one of those things of which we would not speak. After making my official report, I never brought it up and none of my companions ventured to ask. Dorian was the only person who knew, and the most he'd ever said of it was, "We shall not let it be so." When Cassandra volunteered her life to defend us, he saw a noble seeker of truth. When envy demons tore Leliana limb from limb, he saw the final strike against a woman long dead. When that pride demon threw Salas' corpse at its feet, he saw only another dead elf. However much he'd come to care for me now, Tevinter had numbed Dorian to the slight of a dead elf long ago. Compared to the other horrors of that world, it was the least of his concern. But it plagued me still. The death, or potential death, of Cassandra and Leliana seemed to me an act of duty. It had been their inquisition, and they'd given their lives to it from the start. The right and left hands of the divine burned for vengeance, so when they died for Justinia. But Salas had only come to help, he had no gods to bring him comfort, no righteous cause to cling to. And so, despite our success in Redcliffe, I often felt his blood on my hands. The memory was no less real to me. Some version of Salas had pledged his life to me, and I'd seen him sacrifice that life with no more than a backwards glance. The act had immeasurably deepened my faith in this Salas, whom Leliana and Cassandra still held at arm's length. I knew the exact measure of his dedication. What I wanted to know was. Salas let loose an arrow, jarring me from my thoughts, and it struck a quail. In a heartbeat more, the bird fell, frightening a hare from the underbrush. By then I'd drawn my arrow, so I let it fly, and the hare was killed outright. Impressive. Andruil's luck. It's been a while. Luck had nothing to do with it. You train your will to control magic and withstand possession. Your indomitable focus is a side benefit. Indomitable focus. He shrugged, presumably. I have yet to see it dominated. I imagine that the sight would be fascinating. For a second the ocean roared in my ears, then I skipped ahead to claim our spoils and hide the laughter that threatened to bubble up. From anyone else it might have been an playful innuendo, but Salas and I had never joked like that. I shouldered my bow and kept my back to him, still not sure of how to respond. He wasn't Dorian, he didn't tease. If Salas were fascinated with domination, I could trust it nothing more than the interest of a tactician. Though, gods, it still made me blush. Then something whooshed past me, and I felt a hot spray of blood on my face. I flung up a reflexive barrier as a wolf stumbled out of the underbrush before me, an arrow in its eye. It staggered another pace and fell dead at my feet. I was absolutely stunned to see one so far from the blighted hinterlands. Salas knelt to retrieve his arrow, poor fellow. It was terribly bad luck, and I called fire to my fingers. No Dalish left a dead wolf in the woods. He hooked his head at the fire, licking up my arm. Put aside your superstition, Delenn. Let this warn his pack that they've wandered into another's territory. Chapter 4, Fascinating. Some days later, I'd have to consider the fact that Salas had, indeed, chosen his words carefully. A pride demon caught me unawares near a rift at Redcliffe Farm, snatching me off my feet with one monstrous arm wrapped around my ribcage. Its other hand snapped to my chin, exposing my throat to its razor-tipped claws. An instant before it was too late, I channeled lightning through us both. I'd expected to slip from its grasp as it reeled from the shock, but it spasmed instead, crushing me more tightly. I'd no mana left to fight and little breath to scream. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the world around me ground to a halt, and I took stock of the battlefield. A good distance off, Iron Bull was facing down a shade, Sira was trying not to shit herself as she fought despair, and Salas was even farther away, bridging ice across the narrow stream to shield them. They were all too far away. In a moment the pride demon would regain its bearings, and in a moment I'd be dead. I reached out for my magic to find the mark on my palm, burning but useless, and so there was more than a little panic in my gasping cry, "Somebody, help!" Suddenly I was tumbling down a faraway hill, desperately clinging to someone. Salas. He must have taken a fade step through the fight to reach me, then another to catapult us to a muddy patch at the edge of the creek. I landed face down with him atop me, the air knocked from my lungs. I thrashed to scramble up, but he was pinning me with his weight and gripping the nape of my neck with one hand to hold me down. Magic crackled through the air, and I distantly realized he was protecting me from his staff, spinning above as he cast a blizzard into the fray to cover our retreat. The air stilled and he shifted suddenly, his grip tightening, body bending. Warmth brushed the blade of my ear in the rush of a whisper. Fascinating. He stepped back through the fade and into the battle, leaving me breathless and alone. And half naked, as it turned out. Somewhere in the creek basin, a demon's corpse clutched the remains of my empty cloak in one monstrous paw. It took all the bravado of an Antivan crow to march back and close the rift wearing little more than Dalish underwrapping and leather breeches. Sira crammed her fingers in her mouth to whistle, then took them back out to clap her wild applause. There she is, the pride of the Dalish, her gracious lady bits. Fucking hot, boss. I was not wrong in suspecting that it would be a long march back to Haven. Sira and Bull were busy inventing the tale of my strip defense which rendered demons senseless, and there was no dissuading them from embellishing to the extent that I had actually wound up naked. Never mind that I was covered from breastbone to hip, never mind my leather breeches and bracers remained perfectly intact. Somewhere along the way, Salas draped his long, green vest around me, the backs of his fingers briefly grazing my shoulders. It was a chiefly symbolic gesture as I was by no means indecent. The persistent redness in my ears, which Sira all too gleefully pointed out, had far more to do with a single word. Fascinating. I couldn't stop thinking of Salas anew, for the first time noticing the lean lines of muscle that belied his age, the way he gripped his staff, and the sternness that often edged into his voice. Creators, I was a mess. The roughness of our tumble down the hill and the ghost of his hand still lingering on my neck turned the memory of an awkward phrasing into something else entirely. He'd mean what he said on our hunt then, about. Even thinking it sent a fresh wave of heat twitching from the tips of my ears. Bull and Sira went straight for the tavern, while Salas continued down the path alone. I wanted very much to follow after him, but it would have been a terribly obvious thing. So I feigned enthusiasm in joining the others at Flissa's, buying time to process exactly what had transpired. Salas had never even acknowledged a kinship between us, aside from calling me Delenn, nor had I imagined him anything more than Har. I was not his equal, not in knowledge or skill, not in wisdom, nor strategy. I had such an admiration for his experience in the Fade, for the insights he freely shared, and the way he managed to ease my transition among the Shemlin. And even when he'd goad me into an argument about the Dalish, his delivery made it a welcome distraction from the homesickness that threatened to swallow me whole. By then, Salas had seen me flirt with, well, everyone else often enough. Dorian and I came on to each other harder than sailors in a port tavern, while my archer boasted that I would be swayed by Team Sierra in the end. We were all perfectly aware of our mutual disinterest, so the teasing felt safe, a little game to pass the time. I flirted with Varric to make Bianca blush, he insisted that she did, an iron bull to provoke the outrageous commentary, hell, I'd even teased Cullen a time or two before. My only misstep had been with Blackwell, who was sincere in his affection. Perhaps Salas thought us close enough that he could join in as well, perhaps he presumed my indifference. Creators, but it was different with him. It was a keeper's job to remember, and he had collected more elven memories and lore than all the clans combined. It was a keeper's job to protect, and in some awful world he'd already given his life. It was a keeper's job to train up a first, and was he not doing just that in teaching me to strengthen the veil? The only role of a keeper he could not fulfill was the right of Valislin, but somehow I felt he'd left a mark on me all the same. I didn't imagine Salas would appreciate any comparison to a keeper, but I saw in us the same dynamic, felt our relationship worthy of the same respect. He was not a smirking Dalish rogue like Joven that I could drag down into an Aravel. He was a teacher and a mentor and a friend, returning the same playful banner I threw at everyone else so easily. Tangled in those thoughts, I lost track of how many times Sierra brought me a drink, and by the end of it Varric declared me so unbelievably, shitastically drunk that he insisted on seeing me home. I watched him amble off from my window before slipping out and scrambling up to the roof and over the walls. I was too drunk to suffer drowning in a fluffy human bed. I found my cash just as I'd left it and banished the wards that kept it safe. My staff was still at home, but I needed only my fingertips to set a woodless fire burning in the snow. I shook out my blankets and curled up like a cat, falling asleep with the sharp scent of resin and elfroot in a borrowed woolen vest. Chapter 5, In Your Heart Shall Burn. Corypheus had wrenched my arm from its socket and crushed my wrist in his hand. The pain was blinding, and I hadn't a potion to spare. It felt like days of stumbling in the darkness of the mountain and trudging through waist-deep snow. There were no stars to guide me or landmarks along the path, but my mark the anchor, he called it, sputtered dark magic that seemed to drag me through the night. And then there was Cullen, scooping me into his arms, and Cassandra somewhere near to whisper her prayer of thanks. After that, it was nothing but blackness and fitful sleep, the sense of drowning and falling, pulling but never feeling free. It was anger and fear and panic swirling all around, but a warm hand on my brow when I woke. I was not expecting Mother Giselle, but there she was. She turned away every panicked thought with a gentle word, quelled my blasphemy by abstracting belief until there was room enough for us both. And when the memory of Corypheus threatened to overwhelm me once more, she sang. I thought it a sort of lullaby, then Leliana's voice joined in, her scheming and violence set aside for something sweet and pure. I recalled that she'd once been a chantry sister, then realized the song must be part of the chant. Cullen lifted his broken voice, which emboldened the soldiers and pulled the whole camp into song. It was haunting and beautiful, raw Shemlin worship that left me on the outside looking in. Then my stomach churned as, one by one, the people began falling at my feet. Comfort slipped away and I was alone and standing. These were not my people, not my songs, not my gods, not my home. Please get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up. I was paralyzed. The last time an elf dared to tread in matters of human faith, they'd cut off his ears and burned him on a pyre. Sharton was no hero among the Dalish, but a cautionary tale, do not get involved. When it all closed in around me, there was a sharp voice from behind. A word. My heart lurched again. I hadn't seen Salas since we were parted at the Trebuchets in Haven, and instead of a warm greeting he was briskly leaving camp. I grabbed my staff and rushed after him. If his instincts were anything like mine, then it was time for 2 elven mages to be gone. This was a tightrope we could not walk. Then I noticed his gait was relaxed. Confident, even swaggering, as he took me to a small grove and lit a balefire torch. When he spoke, his tone was unlike anything I'd heard from him before, as if I were an equal and not a wayward child. The humans have not raised one of our people so high for ages beyond counting. Her faith is hard-won, Lethalin, worthy of pride. Lethalin, one of his kinsmen. I did not fail to notice that he'd never called me that before. Away from prying eyes, he stood every inch an elf. More than an elf, the way a prince is more than a man noble. And somehow he was proud that a ragged crowd of terrified Shemlin had bowed at my feet to heap their unwanted faith on my shoulders. It was a look I'd never seen in anyone. The man who had treated his elven nature as something no more important than the color of his eyes then spoke of our people and our gods. And then he brought me into his confidence. The orb was ours too. It was exactly the sort of revelation that could bend reverence to violence, but he was prepared. We must be above suspicion to be seen as valued allies. At the time he sounded so wise, and it wasn't until much later that I'd realize he wasn't talking about me at all. Chapter 6, Lethalin. He sent me scouting north, and nightmares hounded me in the fade along the way. Memories of my arm wrenched out of socket, Corypheus dangling me aloft, pulling me toward his awful face. Behind him demons swirled, promising to lend their power to my cause if only I would reach out with my other hand, if only I would call their name, if only I would open a rift, if only. The scar on my palm throbbed with twisted magic, and a steady voice pulled me from the darkness. I was wrapped up in his arms, he was stroking my hair. Maeth, Lethalin. Daratisha, Maeth. Maeth. The fade still wrapped around my thoughts, carried whispers across the veil. Let us help you, little elf. When I'd finally grown calm, Salas let go and rocked back on his heels. I came to wake you lest the whole camp think us under attack. I half-sobbed a little laugh. It was Corypheus, and demons were. His voice was hard, they cannot reach you. I palmed the clammy sweat from my forehead, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. Would you like some air? He asked. Come with me, Lethalin. He led me through the 100 tents, our bare feet crunching in the snow, and along the rock wall that bound us in on the east. He climbed up a jagged outcropping, then brought me through a crevasse that fed into a larger ravine. The air felt thick and warm, humid. I noticed steam escaping the rock face when we made camp, he said. A hot spring. He brought me to a place with a few snowy rocks that led to a rough-hewn cavern where steam billowed out into the night air. He bowed slightly and turned his back on me. After you. Where a human might pause to fret over some chantry shame, the Dalish had no such qualms. We didn't have time to pretend that each one of us could hoard a river to ourselves for the sake of some misbegotten modesty. Women might love women just as easily as men, so segregating ourselves seemed pointless. I shucked off my sweat-soaked clothes, and unwound the cotton ribbon that bound me from breast to hip. When I sank into the water, it was with a stream of profanities escaping in alternate waves of pain and delight. Gods, it was hot. All settled, I called out when the water nearly reached my chin. I kept my eyes low, but heard the soft clink of his many buckles and straps coming undone, and the quiet rustle of cotton and ring velvet, then nothing more than a ripple as he joined me without complaint. I looked up to the full moon and the splattering of stars beyond, then felt my anxiety begin to uncoil in waves. His smile was thin but warm. Dorian will give us no end of grief should he hear that we elves were bathing in the moonlight. There he was, invoking we so readily when just days ago he'd taken me to task for including him among our people. Then should we frolic, Harin? Sing to the creators. Perish the thought. We lounged across from one another in companionable silence, our legs stretched out before us, and I was grateful to be allowed the chance to soak my nightmare away. I found a smooth stone in the water to scrub at my skin, and Salas told me about ancient elven bathhouses in the exalted plains. I spotted paw prints in the snow as he spoke. A lone wolf had tread here not long ago, and for a moment I wished we had the protective walls of those forgotten bathhouses. They were larger than I'd ever seen, nearly a handspan across. I was reminded of the wolf he'd killed outside of Haven, and that we had not even arrows now. I inclined my head toward the tracks. Is it wise that we came without our staves? The corner of his mouth twitched up in a devious smile. Is the herald of Andraste afraid of a wolf? I snorted my disbelief and leaned back against the rock wall as if to exaggerate my calm. The turn of conversation brought my attention to Salas' wolf bone amulet, resting neatly atop his clothes. Dalish propriety had carried me this far, but this one detail made me suddenly, keenly aware that he was well and truly naked. His neck was bare, and water pooled in the hollows of his clavicle. I imagined my tongue darting out to lap at it, imagined straddling him and thumbing his ear. Unlike Varric or Blackwool, the skin on his chest was smooth and the wiry muscle sharp underneath. He clearly did not spend all of his time in the Fade. He nudged my leg with a toe, jolting me to the present. You seem lost in thought, Lethalin. However chaste, given the unspoken rules of a hot spring, any touch at all was a violation of those boundaries. Or an invitation to tear them down. I wondered if the want were written so plainly on my face. I glanced up and caught him following the lines of my valislin, from my lower lip and down my throat to where blood writing disappeared below the waterline. So this tension between us was not an imagined thing. I was wondering, why do you call me Lethalin? Should I deny our kinship? Forgetting for a moment that you so often do, is it not properly declined Lethalin for women? Ah, and then came a laugh, a recent trend. Ancient elves made no distinction between male and female. Oh? I thought perhaps you might appreciate the distinction. Committing to a gambit, I rose from the water to stand at his feet. The water reached only mid-calf, and my nipples tightened in the cold air. His eyes flicked down the remaining trail of valislin, from my jawline and between my breasts, then lower still where they fanned out across my hips. The sign of June, sylvanwood branches in full. I shifted my weight to step forward and his jaw clenched. Arabellas, Delenn, I should be more careful with my words. He carefully fixed his eyes on some point in the snow. To my credit, I didn't flinch, but I wasn't about to gather up my clothes and run off like a scolded child. Arabellas, I should not have mentioned it. I left my clothes where they were, dread wolf take them, and stepped down from the spring. Safely through the ravine and away from his gaze, or rather the horrible weight of his averted eyes, I began shaking violently. I had magic enough to mask my return to camp, but by the time I'd buried myself in blankets, my breath was ragged and stuttering. Creators, what had I done? I'd never misjudged a man so badly. Chapter 7, Rifts were closing. We continued through the mountains bearing north, Salas now calling me Delenn with the same cool tone Cullen used to invoke Herald. To the commander, I was either a prophet of Andraste or an apostate one spell away from abomination. Titles kept a distance between us, so that he wouldn't hesitate to serve or smite when the time came. And so Salas did the same, framing me as a child distracted from her studies, unwilling to acknowledge that I'd ever offered more. Skyhold changed everything. I knew it to be a present of sorts, but it was only one more thing I could not understand. I'd only just managed to find peace in the walls and doors of Haven, a ramshackle settlement at best, and now I was locked within battlements and parapets set behind obsidian gates. There were no trees in the bailey, or at least none to satisfy my Dalish sensibilities, and the grass was patchy and bare. Where everyone else was lost in the wonder of it, I was simply lost. I could make no sense of the winding corridors, and doors never opened into the places that I'd expect. Some closed altogether. Salas was beyond my reach now, going so far as to station himself in the rotunda, quite literally under Leliana's nose. If I wanted to speak with him, I'd have to choose words I wouldn't mind echoing through the whole tower, as our every conversations would be a matter of public record. He'd still explain more complicated matters with his usual grace, and I could always garner his slight approval with a clever question, but he'd have done no less for Cassandra. I remembered when we were strangers who'd shared a flask in the woods, and when his friendship was my anchor. It felt to me as if a shimmering thread ran between us, one that couldn't be cut or broken. I contented myself by thinking that if it were real, it didn't matter whether we ever spoke of it or not. Before we'd even settled our wounded soldiers, Leliana and Cassandra arranged an ambush to declare me the Inquisition's de facto leader, as if that made any sense at all. Did they not see that it was Salas? That it had always been Salas. While they once fretted over a chantry murder mystery, he risked everything to study the breach itself. While they debated sending me off to Valroy for trial, he discovered my anchor was the key. While they worried over broken circles and rogue Templars, he found ways to strengthen the veil and protect us all. Where even King Alistair only wanted an excuse to banish Fiona and her mages, Salas saw a chance to finally close the breach. When we were scattered and lost, he gave us Skyhold. It infuriated me that they refused to acknowledge his right, that he never reached out to claim what should be his, that he'd been pushing me toward this from the start. But most of all, I was infuriated with myself for grasping for more. So when I stood on the steps to pick up their heavy Shemlin sword, I gave myself over to building an inquisition rather than a clan. In short order I had a wardrobe of human clothes, down to socks and smalls in a breast band. The tunic and breeches were simple but fine, plush fustian velvet inlaid with milky quartz and trimmed in copper. I was told the design came from the Free Marches, as if I were from Wycombe rather than the wilderness around it. I had them install Ferelden glass in the windows, hang dwarven draperies, raise Dalish banners, build a cunary throne. I'd make it known that the Inquisition stood for Thetis. I slept in an Orlchion bed made with honey-colored silk, and I considered it a sort of rune. If I laid within its boundaries it could steal me for the game. Dressing each morning was a ritual, a spell that might transform an elf meant for the robes of a keeper into a human girl raised for the throne. I still wore Dalish armor when traveling. I'd be a fool to upset my comfort in combat, and I kept us traveling almost constantly. The anchor called out a sort of hunger, driving me to gather magic. I'd only known a few spells as first, how to call a campfire, set protective runes, calm a Hala with sleep. But now my magic felt dangerous, and I set aside my defensive spells to go on the attack. Sometimes in battle lightning struck enemies without my command, and sometimes my mark flared out of control, shredding packs of pride demons the way sunlight dispels a mist. If others noticed how loosely I held my own leash, they said nothing. The rifts were closing, after all, one by one. In the evenings, Josephine would visit my chambers in secret and we dined together every night. I didn't care what was said if others noticed her comings and goings, but with Josephine's discretion I doubt anyone knew at all. She taught me how to lay a napkin across my lap, how to hold a wine glass by its stem, and the careful order to the flatware that dictated their use. The tiny fork for shellfish, and the one with 2 tines for lotus root, the narrow spoon for scooping out marrow, and the broad one meant for soup. This knife was for butter, and that for carving meat. Josephine explained to me all the titles and positions I'd never learned: Your Grace, Your Highness, Your Majesty, Your Reverence, Your Holiness, First Enchanter, Lady Magister, Lord Seeker, Sir Knight. Most importantly, she taught me to hide the curl of my lip whenever someone bowed to whisper, Your Worship. I suspect she regarded me with a gentle disdain. I thought that if anyone as soft-hearted as Josie could hold a lack of social grace against me, then I'd never win the nobles to our cause. So I put aside my indignation at bowing to Shemlin custom and redoubled my efforts to learn. As if courtly manners might help me forget the way his hand felt on the back of my neck, or that he'd once called me Lethalin. Chapter 8, Deft Hands, Fine Tools. Skyhold was work without end. Hauling out the refuse and debris that had piled up in years of abandonment, mending holes in the roof, shoring up the masonry, and scrounging for herbs to treat our many wounded. Other wounds could not be patched up so easily. I sat with Cole when a gracious cut ended the life of a soldier who'd been limping along since Haven. I wanted so very badly for the man to be all right, but as Cole projected his every waking thought, it became clear that death was a kindness. When it was over and the surgeon who saw it made to forget, I was chagrined to find Josephine hadn't yet trained the Dalish out of me as I licked my thumb to smudge away a splash of blood on Cole's cheek. Gods, he looked something like a corpse himself. His skin was mottled and gray, lips a little blue, and his eyes veiled by a cloudy film. Yet he had a shy sweetness that reminded me of my own little brother before he'd become so clever with his knives. I imagined he was with the clan somewhere near Tantor Vale by now, probably not the barefaced young man I'd left behind. I took Cole's hand in my own, led him up stone steps to the southern turret, through a half-rotted wooden door that led into the upper reaches of the tavern. It smelled like pine logs and roasted meats, spiced ale, and leather. It was warm and cheerful, with bursts of laughter and music drifting up through the rafters. I thought it might be the sort of place where a spirit of compassion might not be crushed by the worries of the surgeon or the tension of the practice yard. See? You'll always be close enough to see what's happening, but not so much that their hurts hurt you back. You hid in a tavern, too, he said slowly, the one that's buried in snow. I wasn't hiding, Cole. I was learning about my new friends. Not my people, not my songs, not my gods, not my home. For a second I was out in the darkness again, somewhere between Haven and Skyhold, and so very afraid. I cocked my head to smile at him under the brim of his hat. Just don't tell them that, Delenn. They've shown me such kindness. But they put you in a prison, bound you in chains. It was a strange thing to hear my panic in his voice, remembering for me. It was a moment I tried not to think about, when I first woke in the chantry basement. It's more complicated than that. I was unknown to them, a Dalish apostate, and they were scared. You were scared, but you didn't hurt anyone. You tried to help. It's a little depressing when you put it like that, but I suppose that makes us a bit alike, you and I trying to help even when we don't quite belong. Yes. And then he was quick to add, but I'm not pretending. Cole's words blew through me, and my snug velvet tunic suddenly felt too thin. I was awed by this little spirit, the way he knew just where to slip the knife. I can keep them for you, he offered, and I didn't have to ask. I perched on the crate beside him, and he helped me tug off my leather boots. He quietly picked the lock on an old chest in the corner to cram them inside, then Cole held out his hand until I gave him my woolen socks too. Chapter 9, Leave Her Be. Hey, Enki. Know what's good for not slippin' on a patch of ice? We hadn't even fully crossed the bridge from Skyhold, and I was regretting my decision to bring Syrah. Shoes, she finished. Answers shoes. They're as uncomfortable as fuck and you know it. Yeah, like getting shite in your toes. It was going to be a long journey. Leliana had brought word of a Dalish clan in the Exalted Plains whose first had run off to the Emerald Graves. At least Clan Lavalan had time enough to prepare for my departure. I feared that without a true first to aid in their protection this clan would be yet another casualty of the Orlshian civil war. So instead of offering my assistance outright, a charity the Dalish would likely not accept, I wanted to negotiate their help in rebuilding Skyhold. It would be work enough to see them through the winter, and they could find shelter and trade within our walls. If they had the skill to smelt glass for the windows, all the better. It would be worth redoing if it meant every ray of light to illuminate the Great Hall would be tinted with elven magic. I'd brought Syrah, along with Salas and Varric, to show this clan that the Inquisitor was no Shemlin pawn. Of course, bringing along 2 flat ears posed a risk, but less so than a Cunary or a human if my own clan were any indication. As it turned out, Keeper Haan provided a warm welcome with nothing more than my Valislan to recommend us. His own brother was Haran to an alienage in Lides, and so neither Salas nor Syrah could egg him on. Haan was not the sort of Dalish with an axe to grind, and my heart sang to see the people so well represented. The keeper was open to the idea of wintering in Skyhold, but had unfinished business to attend on the plains. It took 2 days to help settle their affairs, and on the second night the clan held a feast. There were small fishes roasted in nettle leaves, boiled lotus root, and flat bread baked on heated stones. After we ate, several of us went out to the Innovuris to bathe. Later we sat around the fire, and Varric told the wildest story about a Dalish named Daisy who met Ashabelinar at the altar of Mythal on Sundermount. Amalian sat on a log behind me, her fingers gently touching the top of my wet head. I don't know what I'd do, she said softly, without my lethalin to tie up my hair. Ma Serenas, it has been a very long time since I've worn braids. My hair was nearly waist length, but fuzzy and ragged by my left ear where Adon had to shave it clean to stitch up a gash. It was traditional for a first to let it grow until ascending to keeper, when it would be cut short to signify new beginnings. I'd almost cut it all off in Haven, but I wasn't quite ready to admit I would not begin anew with my own clan once more. As Varric's story wore on, I let my eyes drift shut. It felt so close to being home. Varric had just reached to the part where Ashabelinar turned into a dragon, the surprise in his voice convincing me that he'd actually seen her. Yet flickering firelight and the steady rhythm of Amalian's plaiting fingers pulled me into sleep despite my interest. It had been a very long day, and a sad one. We'd found her brother's journal in a pile of rubble, but Varric had known just how to twist the darkness of what we learned into something more manageable. Not that death was ever manageable. After she finished braiding, Emelian kept stroking my hair as if I were a cat. I'd done it for my little sisters 1,000 times before, lulling them to sleep by the fire. Surely she was remembering her brother. She later slid out from behind me, tucking a folded blanket under my head, and I snuggled down as quiet footfalls told me she'd made her escape. Inquisitor. It was Salas, but before I could rouse myself another blanket was falling around my shoulders. Emelian answered him in hushed whispers. She fell asleep a little while ago, Harin. I couldn't bring myself to wake her. Then I shall do so, he answered, ever pragmatic. Our people have set up camp nearby. It must be difficult to imagine, having grown up in the city, but we Dalish are quite happy under the stars. You should leave her be. I drew on the focus of 1,000 battles to kill the twitching muscles of a smile that threatened to blow my cover. Never had a Dalish more respectfully called another of the people a flat ear. Minutes of silence stretched on after that, leaving me to guess whether Salas had bowed his head in mock respect or given her a stern look in parting. Whatever the case, I said a silent prayer to Silas that she'd driven him from the campfire. I hadn't slept beneath the stars since our journey to Skyhold, and it had been even longer since I'd done so without fearing for my life. I would have given up that moment if Salas had pressed the issue, but I wouldn't have been any happier for it. There was a quiet sound beside me, like someone crouching by the fire, and a gentle hand on my head once more. It seemed my Lethalin had come to guard me from the flat-eared Harin. I don't know how much longer I slept, warm fingers feathering over my hair, but when a calloused thumb ran along the edge of my ear, I knew that it was Salas. I didn't dare move. If he knew that I was awake, he gave no indication. Seconds seemed to stretch into hours, then for a brief moment his fingers tightened in my hair. You should leave her be, he whispered. And then he was gone. Chapter 10, It Must Be a Sickness. I woke to the familiar sounds of mourning in a clan. Hala hooves stamping at the dirt, women laughing as they returned from the stream with traps full of fish, and the keeper casting fresh wards around camp. Salas was sitting near the fire, sipping a mug of something, and studiously looking away by the time I made a show of opening my eyes and stretching out from the blankets. Sleep well, he asked, as if noticing me for the first time. I never knew what to do with him. He'd already shown that he'd step out of reach if I forced the issue, and yet he kept placing himself in my path. The tension between us was a hangnail I couldn't leave alone. I stood and shook out the blanket, trying to match his nonchalance by folding it absently as I spoke. It must be difficult to imagine, Salas, having grown up in the city, but we Dalish believe that when a boy pulls a girl's hair, it's to get her attention. He clenched his jaw the way he'd done in the hot spring, rose to his feet and tossed the remains of his morning cup on the fire. If I wanted your attention, Lethalin, I'd have you on your knees. My stomach twisted at the shock of it, my ears went hot. He took a step closer and for a moment his eyes were on something in distance, then he dropped his gaze and his tone turned sharp. Keep playing these little games with Dorian, Delenn, but do not push me again. The last 4 words came out in a clipped staccato, and I stood as still as stone. There was real heat there, an anger just beneath the surface. He strode off toward where Varric had made camp, and I numbly returned the blankets to Emelian and hid myself in the simple work of packing our gear. Time and again, I misjudged my interactions with Salas. I didn't think I'd ever seen him angry before, not like this. But, creators, it must be a sickness that it still quickened my pulse. Once we hit the road, I was grateful for Sira's inane chatter. Anything else was better than thinking about it. I'd planned on making for the Emerald Graves in search of Haan's missing first, but now I turned us to Skyhold. Salas disappeared into the rotunda as soon as we returned, and I realized I had no hope of dragging Sira or Varric back on the road. We were all tired from the journey, but I was not tired enough by half. I would not survive a day of stewing in my quarters, nor the paperwork of the war table. So I caught Cassandra and Blackwell in the courtyard, then sent word for Dorian I wasn't setting foot in that god's forsaken tower to fetch him. I wanted to kill things, but I should have known better than to think there'd be any happy endings in a place called the Emerald Graves. There was an awkward silence after I tore through a giant on my own, destroying the thing in unrelenting waves of fire and lightning and the void of the fade. We cleared out a whole grove of giants to reach the spot Haan had marked on my map, but finding only a broken Aravel and cold elven corpses brought the darkness closing in around me. The Sylvanwood ring of Fenharel marked a black Cauyered mage as Haan's missing first. Blackwell wouldn't let me handle the bodies alone, never mind that it was the work of a keeper, but I let him help me lay them to rest in the shade of a massive tree. I gathered a few articles from each of the elves, so Haan's clan would have something to mourn them by. It was so senseless, they had only wanted to reclaim a piece of their history. Our history. When the work was done, I squeezed Blackwell's arm in silent thanks, and he trudged back through the woods to find Dorian and Cassandra. For the first time without my keeper, I performed the Dalish funeral rites before casting the white-hot flames of their pyre. It was an unusual spell, never invoked for combat or campfires, and I was grimly pleased that I'd managed it on my own. I said a prayer to Phalandin, and it was done. Check the description for the links to the author.